Lord God, thank you so much for giving us this time together, and bless us as we go about looking at your word. In the name of Christ we pray. Amen.
Amen.
All right, we're going to be looking at Galatians, and we are going to, because I have kind of fooled around for a while, we're going to hit this running. Looking at the book of Galatians, short letter of Paul. We're not going to look at a whole lot of background in terms of Paul. Just a couple of things just for you to file away. When you look at anything by Paul, the Apostle Paul is what I call a plotter. He's a plotter. And a plotter is someone who moves really slowly. A lot of times people approach Paul's letters like they do the Gospels. And the Gospels, they have a story. And then you have another story. Then you have another story. Then you have another. And in Bibles that have headings, you go through Paul's letters and it'll be a heading. And then 10 verses later, another heading. And then 10 verses later, another heading. And we get the idea he's making all these points. That's not how Paul writes. For one, Paul is dictating all of this. Because we've talked about papyrus being so valuable. You had scribes that wrote in a very small hand that would write it down. And Paul's eyesight wasn't very good because he says in the Roman letter, I'm writing this myself. You can see how big the letters are. You don't want to write the whole letter with great big letters. It's too expensive. So he would dictate. And when Paul dictated, he approaches things slowly. He presents a point, he proves a point, he proves it again, he proves it again and again. He doesn't move fast. He's very methodical. He anticipates questions, I think rhetorical questions, because all of his letters are being read out loud. So he's anticipating, you imagine reading to a group, anticipating somebody in the back of the room raising their hand and saying, well, what about? And Paul seems to anticipate those. So he moves very, very slowly. Every I is dotted, every T is crossed. So if you're reading Paul and you're confused, it's probably you're reading him too fast. Or you're looking for too many points. He really makes one point, but boy, oh boy, he really makes it. And supports it and goes within that point in a lot of different directions, but it stays sort of self-contained. We're going to see that when we look at today. Also, Paul uses, his sentences are really long in Greek. They are really long because he has what are called participial phrases, which are sort of because. If a phrase starts with because or when or by, those are all participial phrases. And he'll string like 10 of them together. So he has these enormous sentences. In English Bibles, they break them up because you just can't have so. They're just really awkward. But he's dictating, and somebody is writing it down. So as he's dictating, he's not stopping his thought. He just kind of runs on. One other thing that Paul uses, and we'll see it in what you're looking at now, and this is really important, even if you're looking at an English translation. Well, of course, that's what you'd be doing. He uses a lot of what are called gar clauses. And the Greek word gar is translated in English for. And when you read Paul and you see for at the beginning of a sentence, that's what's called a gar clause sentence. And what that word, how it was used in Greek, is it answers a question that's implied by what came before it. It sort of does that in English, but we don't think in those terms. But Paul really does. So when you see a for, F-O-U-R in your
I was looking
reading.
at F-O-R.
F-O-R. I'm sorry, F-O-R. If it's F-O-R, if you see that, then it really deals with what comes before. Now that's just Greek grammar. It kind of becomes interesting because, like, if you ask most Christians what their favorite verse is in the Bible, what one verse is your favorite? I think a lot of Christians, maybe not most, but a lot of Christians, maybe most, would say John 3:16, right? Mm-hmm. Which is what? For God so loved the world. Well, it starts with a for, gar, which means that sentence is secondary. You got to find what came before it, because that's answering a question implied by what came up earlier. So the important sentence is before John 3:16, and it happens to be John 3:13 or John 14 and 15. That's the key sentence in that whole little deal with Nicodemus about the Son of Man being lifted up onto a cross like the serpent was lifted up in the wilderness. And everything, there's a whole string of for, gar clauses that support that idea. And Paul uses that all the time in his letters. So when you're reading it, you look at the for. Don't assume he's starting a new thought. No paragraph should begin with the word for, because that's secondary to what goes on ahead. Okay, just something to think about.
Makes it a little confusing. Doesn't it?
Well, it does, and especially when you look at the original Greek, since they weren't even dividing words. That's why you had to have scribes. It's like reading Morse code. They didn't even divide the words up. You had to have somebody that knew it so well that they could take these lines of sentences and break them into words. If they're not dividing words, they're not doing new paragraphs at all. You had to just figure that out. But they were really good at doing it. They were good listeners. We're not as good as they were because we don't have to. We can read it. But you're right. It is kind of confusing. Once you kind of get used to it, you say, oh, okay, that makes sense. Sometimes we get, though, a little misled. We may put the emphasis in the wrong place, which causes us, as we read it, to kind of get off track a little bit. Okay, that's just a little bit. Okay, you got John. We're at the beginning of Galatians chapter 1, verse 1. Who's the author of this work? Okay, the Apostle Paul. How does he describe himself? How does he describe? So Paul is the writer of this letter. How does he describe himself?
Christ.
Okay, he says he is what?
A man.
An apostle, right? I am an apostle. Now that's really important, because when we were looking back a ways at Luke saw 12 apostles and Paul ain't one of them. And in Acts, Paul ain't one of them. But right here at the beginning of Galatians, Paul says, I am an apostle. Now, why would he say I am an apostle?
Because he wanted to be.
Yeah, because he wanted to be. And he's writing to this church. He wants them to what?
Believe in it.
Yeah, believe in what he's writing. He wants them to take him seriously. So he's established, and he sincerely believes. Because how he defines apostle is different than how Luke. Because Paul believed if you saw the risen Christ, you were and sent out to do the work, you were an apostle. And therefore he will say, I was the last of the apostles because I encountered Christ on the Damascus Road. So I am the last of the apostles, but there were 200 more when Jesus appeared, to 200, he says, that were gathered. Okay, so he sees this now. So he's claiming an authority that he believes he has. He also describes how he became an apostle, right? How does he say he became an apostle? And this kind of gives us a clue about an issue that may be in the Galatian church. How does he describe himself as an apostle?
By Jesus Christ.
Okay, I was made an apostle by Jesus, right? As opposed to by
Men.
By men. I wasn't appointed as an apostle by men. I became an apostle from Jesus. Now, again, we're thinking, now why is he writing this letter? Just clues about what may be happening in the Galatian church. Why would Paul say, I'm an apostle by Jesus and not by human authority? What might we assume some people are saying in the Galatian church about Paul?
He's not for real.
For one, he's not a real apostle. Or if he is an apostle, how did he become an apostle? Human beings appointed him. But Paul says, my apostleship isn't from people, from man, it's from Jesus. And then he says, he's writing, this is typical Greek, the way you begin Greek letters, the author, little description, and then He's writing, who's the audience?
The Galatians.
The Galatians, the churches in Galatia. And Galatia's a province. It's not a city like Corinth or Rome or Philippi. It's a province. So there are a whole bunch of churches in the province of Galatia, away from Palestine. So the Galatians were Gentiles. They weren't Jews, because you didn't have a lot of Jews living in Galatia. So it was probably and it certainly was, as we read the letter, it was a Gentile church. Now, usually in a Greek letter, you do this and then you give a blessing. If you look at other letters by Paul, we're thankful, may God bless you, that kind of stuff. That was typical in Greek letters. But in this letter, he doesn't, he sort of hits the ground running. Because in verse 6, he begins to talk about what is motivating his letter. What is motivating this letter he's writing to the Galatians?
Well,
That they're
probably,
deserting the,
Okay, they are deserting, and what are they deserting?
the one who called you.
Okay, in particular, what about the one who called?
they're turning their back on Jesus.
Well, they are, but Paul is going to focus on one aspect of Jesus that they seem to be rejecting.
Divinity or humanity.
Somebody read verse 6.
I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting the one who called you by the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel.
By the grace of Christ. They are turning from that call of grace. They're turning from grace and turning to another gospel. Okay, bang, that's the problem. Now, we don't know how the Galatians are doing that yet, right? But we do know he's writing to a church where he sees a genuine problem. And they are turning away from grace. And what, in sort of a nutshell, is grace? What's meant by grace?
The accepting of Jesus, it's accepting what God is offering.
Okay, well, from where is grace coming?
From God.
Grace comes from God, right? And we respond. But grace is from God is a gift, right? Grace isn't something that we produce. Something that, at least in this context, is something that God has given. It's a gift. So they are turning away from this gift. And what word does he use that they're doing? They're turning away from grace and they're accepting what? Another gospel. They're accepting another good news. Remember, that's what gospel means. Another word of good news. Now, Paul says this, like I said, Paul's a plotter.
Now, does he mean another gospel that's not in the Bible now?
Oh, thank you, John, because Paul anticipates that somebody is going to ask that question, right? Because what does he say in verse 7?
No gospel at all.
Yeah, not that there's another gospel. What Paul says, you are deserting grace and adopting another gospel, but understand there's only one gospel, so it's not a gospel at all that you're accepting. You've turned from grace and accepting what?
My word.
Well, accepting something that's false, right? Something that is perverted, something that is wrong.
Okay, at this time though, you wouldn't have had all four
No,
gospels.
you would. This predates all the guys. There is nothing written about Jesus other than little bits and pieces of.
So why does he call it a gospel then?
What does gospel mean?
Good news.
Good news, an announcement of good news. That's what they're accepting. Not something written down, but they're accepting another announcement of good news. Right, another version of good news that doesn't involve what? Grace. That doesn't involve grace.
And where's it coming from?
Well, we'll find out.
Okay.
Because he's going to tell us where it's coming from. But what he wants to do is lay out, this is the problem. This is why I'm writing to you. Because you have turned from grace and accepting something else. And you can't even call it a gospel because there's only one good news. And that's a good news that centers on grace. And you are turning from it. And in fact, Paul goes on to say, like in verse 10, or verse 8, what does he say? Because he wants to strengthen even more, that they have turned away from the gospel of grace to something else. And I'm going to tell you guys, what does he say?
Be accursed.
If anybody shares with you a gospel other than the one that I brought you, they should be cursed. Well, what
And
if
he says that again in 9.
Yeah, what if an angel comes down and shares with us? An angel from heaven comes down and shares another gospel, another good news. Should they be cursed?
Says so.
You better believe it. What if I come and share with you something different than what I shared with you at first? Should I be cursed? Yeah, boy. So what is Paul saying?
Well, you better believe in grace.
The grace is, you got to believe in
It's the
grace.
answer.
That's right. The gospel of grace. Now, we don't know what that is. We don't know what the Galatians are doing yet. But we know that the problem that Paul sees is that they are turning away from the truth and accepting something else.
I got a question.
Sure.
Just popped in on my mind. Paul has written a lot in the Bible.
Right.
How did the Corinthians, the Galatians, the Romans, I mean, they didn't call him up on the phone and say, the elder or something at the church thing, we're having this problem. Can you make a visit to our church? How did that all happen? I mean, this is, I don't believe the Bible is a historical
Right.
document, I think. So these things happen. So back in those days, how did
Word
he
get
around?
out.
Yeah.
Well, and how would they have gotten out?
A word of mouth, but
Well, yeah, what Paul will talk about, and he will say it at the end of a lot of his letters, he'll talk about so-and-so. Timothy did a lot of this for him. Timothy was connected in Romans with the Roman church and the Corinthian church. He'll talk about Timothy brought word to me about what was going on. And so, yeah, it was primarily, somebody, a representative of his, would come and tell him what was happening in this church. What it meant, though, was unlike today when we have immediate information, we're talking about may have been a year, 2 years, for him to get word that
Right.
something was happening in these churches. Well, a lot of stuff can happen in a year, for Paul to react. And that's why when you look at the Corinthian letters, so much seems to have occurred between the letters. You say, whoa, why didn't Paul put a lid on it? Well, if you separate each of them by 8 months, man, a lot of stuff can happen in 8 months. So things can unravel, things could get healed, a lot of stuff can go on. But that's how this stuff would have been communicated. And he would have had supporters in the church, not only his representatives, but people that were kind of focused on his teaching that would either send something written or more likely have gone themselves to wherever he was located and said, Paul, we got problems.
okay. I guess you could also say a lot could happen in the 8 months, but things moved a lot slower at that time because what he writes a letter about may not even be an issue 8 months later.
It may not have been. We don't know.
No social media.
We don't know whether it would have been or not.
Okay.
Okay, so anyway, now Paul says this, if anybody brings you a contrary gospel, don't believe. Now remember, right at the beginning, he said, I'm an apostle appointed by Jesus, right? Not by human beings. Paul's concerned that somebody's going to say, well, he's only talking because he wants us to like him, or wants approval, or he's representing human beings and not God. And we look at verse 10, so to counsel this out before he gets into his argument, he says what?
And that he spoke to Jesus.
Yeah, that I spoke to. This is coming from Jesus' mouth to your ears. I am not doing it for approval. I'm not doing it to be popular. I'm not sharing this with you, to make myself look good, feel good, raise myself in your eyes. I am giving you the straight gospel. I am giving you the straight scoop. Okay. Now, he's opened his letter. What do we know just from this opening about this letter? What are some of the things we can expect to see in this letter follow? What do we know about the Galatian church, or at least Paul's perception of it, and what can we expect to find as we go deeper?
Well, we know they're Gentiles.
Okay, we know the Gentiles, or we suspect that they're Gentiles. That's going to become more apparent in a little bit. Okay, what else do we know? Just based on what he wrote in those first 12 verses.
Well, somewhere or other they're not taking the correct word and using it.
Okay, they have moved from what he taught them to something else.
Right.
Okay, we know that because that's what he said. And we know that in his mind, what they have done is they've moved from a gospel centered on what? Grace to something else. Don't know what it is, but it's something else, right?
Good.
We also know that there are people in the church that are accusing him of some things. What would it appear as though some people are accusing him of? That he's not really an apostle. That everything he's telling you is secondhand. He got from somebody else. I'm coming in. I knew Jesus myself. I was with him. This is what he taught. Paul is Johnny come lately. And so you don't listen to him, listen to who? Me. And Paul is saying, no. I told you what Jesus says. Now, that's kind of hard because one of the things with Paul is Paul wasn't one of the 12. I mean, Paul wasn't even one of the disciples when Jesus was going through Judea, Galilee and Judea. Paul wasn't there. So Paul wasn't listening to Jesus talk. And understand, those who want to undermine Paul, man, that's what they're going to say. They're going to say, I got this from Peter, and Peter was with Jesus. Paul, geez Louise, Paul? How did Paul get his?
Well, he persecuted before.
Yeah, that makes it even worse.
Right.
A little bit about the background. He was against him. So you're going to listen. Who are you going to listen to, Peter or Paul? Peter, right? Got to listen to Peter. And so that's what they're doing to undermine him. Because Paul gave this gospel about grace and they've turned to something else, and the people that wanted them to turn have been undermining Paul. And so Paul has to establish his credentials. He's got to establish his authority. Okay. Now, and he does that in a really kind of interesting way as he tries to. He starts, when we get to verse 13, he starts telling his story, which is really interesting. And as we look at his story, or the story he gives, we start getting a better idea of what kind of problem is present in the Galatian church. What does he say about himself?
It was his previous way of life.
Okay, he talks about his previous way of life. And what does he say about his previous way of life?
I left it.
What's that?
I left it.
I left it. But what was he doing in his previous life?
Persecuted.
He was persecuting the church of God. He was persecuting Christians. What else does he say about his early life? I was a persecutor of Christians because I was...
It says here, he wasted.
Yeah, right. What did he believe when he was persecuting Christians? He was a Jew. He was a super Jew, right? And in my early life, I was a Jew, and man, I persecuted Christians. Now, in no other letter does he talk about this, but he does in the Galatian letter, which means he must believe that whatever he's saying here might resonate with them. So maybe file that in the back of your head. That this may be part of the issue that we know that the Galatians have shifted away from grace to something else. And Paul now opens, as he establishes his credentials, by saying, I was a Jew. Maybe these Gentiles in the Galatian churches value Judaism. Maybe they value Judaism. We're going to find out that that's exactly the case. But maybe they value, that's why Paul feels comfortable introducing that. So when people hear that, they say, oh, he was a Jew and not an anti-Jew. Okay. He persecuted Christians. What else does he say about himself? In fact, he says about his relationship with Judaism, if you want to look at all the Jews out there, I was top in my Jewish class. There was nobody more Jewish than me. And not only was I advanced in Judaism, my ancestors were Jews. Really interesting that he says my ancestors. He doesn't say our ancestors. If he says our ancestors, who is he including?
Well, he's including the congregation.
He's including the Galatians.
Right.
He says my ancestors, which tell us immediately that he is not including
Their ancestors.
the Galatians, which means the Galatians are
Gentiles.
aren't Jewish. Because if they'd been Jewish, he'd have said our ancestors. But he didn't. He said mine. Okay, so now we still don't know what's going on, but we know we got these Gentiles, and we know for some reason these Gentiles are valuing Judaism.
So is
We don't know why.
Is that one way that in the Greek writings and everything you could distinguish the pronoun that they used if you were Jewish?
Oh, absolutely.
They would consider all Jews as their ancestors.
Absolutely. Jews, if you were a Jew, you would talk about our ancestors, because that's you're part of a people. The fact that he would single out that it's his ancestors, my ancestors, he's excluding his audience. And I think he's doing that intentionally because he doesn't see them as the same. Now, this isn't huge, but it's a little clue that he's not writing to Jews. He's not writing to Jewish Christians. He's writing to Gentile Christians. Okay. So he has established himself. Right at this point, how has he established himself?
Well, his credentials.
Right, because he's going to continue to establish his credentials to this point. By the time we get in those first few verses, what do we know about Paul and what Paul says about himself?
He's an apostle appointed by Jesus.
Okay, well, from verse 12, starting at verse 12, verse 13, 14, what does Paul tell us? He was a super Jew. Nobody was more Jewish than Paul.
It says, mine profited in the Jews' religion above many my equals.
You better believe it. Among all his buddies, he was top-notch Jew. Top-notch Jew. All right, so establishes that background. So we would assume, given this Jewish background, his ancestors, his education, all of it was Jewish, what would we expect Paul to be teaching? Judaism.
Right.
Man, he persecuted the church. We would expect if anybody is going to teach Judaism in the church, it would be
Him.
Paul. Paul knew it better than anybody else.
Is that why God chose him?
What happened? This is Paul describing himself. What happens to Paul in verse 15? Because all of this is Paul, right? What happens in verse 15 according to what Paul writes?
God revealed his son.
God chose Paul and revealed his son to him. And what word does Paul use in that sentence in verse 15? That we've seen before, seems to be a really important word.
Grace.
Grace! Grace! All right? No, I don't think it's any accident that he's working grace. He says the key to understanding the gospel that you are abandoning, you Galatians, is grace. God, by his grace, did what? Revealed Jesus Christ to me. Now, who is in control of this?
God.
God is. Remember we talked about last time, passive voice? Passive voice. God revealed. Or it was pleased to reveal his son to me. Was pleased. Okay, by action of God. And why did God reveal Jesus to Paul? Why did God do it? What does he say? Why did he reveal his son to him?
So that he could preach.
So he could preach to who?
The Gentiles.
To the Gentiles, not to the
Jews.
Man, those Galatians, like I said, that's Gentile church. In fact, what has Paul done for the Galatians? He revealed Jesus Christ to them, right? By the grace of God. He did what God had called and told him to do, right? Okay, and it's by the work of God.
You know, I never thought about the reason Paul was chosen. But if he was that good at what he did before,
Right?
how good could he be for the rest of the world?
This is a huge shift. You know, that God chose somebody who is a super Jew. More Jewish than Peter, more Jewish than John, more Jewish than Thomas, more Jewish than anybody. Chose super Jew to preach the gospel to the Gentiles. That's what Paul says. That God chose him. And the Galatians, they're all Gentiles. So God chose Paul to preach the gospel to them. Now, given that background, somebody in that group is going to say, you know, you're right. Just sort of what you said. You're right. You know, he came late. Jesus was gone when Paul showed up. How would Paul know anything about Jesus? How would Paul know anything about Jesus? He must have what?
He witnessed.
Well, he must have talked to other Christians, right? You know, he must have gotten his information from other Christians. Well, let me ask you, is it better to talk to somebody who got their information from Peter or talk to Peter? Which is better? Is it better for me to tell you what my father said, or would it be better for you to talk to my father?
Talk to you. What'd you say?
Would it be better for me to tell you what my father said, or for you to talk to my father?
Second-hand information.
Second-hand information. I'm going to change it. Better to talk to the father.
Right.
Paul must have got his information from somebody else, right?
You're right.
Let's talk to somebody else. And that's what the people in Galatia, evidently, that's what they're doing. We're getting it from the horse's mouth. Paul is getting it second-hand. Okay, what does he say at the end of verse 16 and 17? To address this concern.
Yeah, didn't consult anyone.
I didn't consult any human being.
Right.
I didn't consult any man. In fact, I didn't go where?
To the apostles.
I didn't go to Jerusalem. I didn't go to the apostles. Instead, what did I do?
You went and studied on your own.
I went and studied on my own.
That's what you told us in Romans.
That's right. I went and studied on my own. I didn't get this information from anybody. I went to Arabia, into the desert to study. Now, what is he inferring is happening to him when he's in Arabia?
He's directly communicating with God.
That's it. He's getting the message directly from God, as he's there. And then later in Damascus, getting the information directly from God. Okay? So, I am not getting this information, what I taught. I didn't get from Peter. I didn't get from John. I didn't get from James. I got it directly from God. So if somebody tells you I'm passing on secondary information, they are what?
Wrong.
Wrong. They are wrong. Now, later, what does Paul do? After 3 years, what does he do? Verse 18.
He went Get
He went to
acquainted with Peter.
Jerusalem.
Okay, but that's after 3 years. And remember, numbers are really important. 3 is a big and a heavenly number. So, after 3 years, now he goes to Jerusalem and he meets Peter, only Paul doesn't use the word Peter to identify him. He uses the word name Cephas. And that's interesting because Cephas is Jewish. That's the Jewish name for Peter. That's the Jewish name for rock. Cephas is rock in Hebrew. So instead of saying Petros, which is Greek for rock, he uses the word Cephas, which is Hebrew for rock. Kind of interesting that he uses a Hebrew name for Peter. I don't think that's an accident. He goes and he talks to Cephas. Who else does he meet in Jerusalem?
James. the brother.
James. Anybody else?
Says I saw none.
Saw nobody else. I went to Jerusalem 15 days. I went and talked to Peter or Cephas, and I talked to James, the brother of Jesus. Those are the only 2 people. Now, understand, Paul is walking a fine line, right? Because on one hand, he's got to show the Galatians that he got his information where?
Straight up.
Straight from God, on one hand. On the other hand, he doesn't want them to think that his ideas are so far out there that they are not Christian at all. If I came to you and said, I've stopped reading the Bible. I'm not reading the Bible. I'm getting everything that I say directly from God through visions. What would you think?
Dream on.
That's it. You'd say, man, I don't know that I want to listen. And I start talking about aliens coming down and, all kinds of crazy stuff. You're going to say to yourself, I don't think I want to listen to
What's
this.
he been drinking?
Yeah, exactly. Or maybe his arteries are hardening or something like that. I'm going to lose my credibility. So he's got to walk the line. I'm independent, so I'm not just passing on secondhand information. But what I'm saying is also in line with what other Christians believe, particularly Christians like Peter and James. So what I'm saying isn't radical. I'm not giving you something that they would say is wrong. So what I got it from God, but it's consistent with what they've been teaching.
So were the Galatians Christians before Paul showed up?
No, probably not. And Paul's going to deal with that.
Okay, all right, but I don't know your name. What
Ken.
Ken?
Ken.
Ken? Wouldn't there be skeptics then within the Galatians saying, this guy came from the desert and he said,
Right.
and just like Peggy said one time
Right.
in one of our classes,
Right.
God never talked to me. So since he had never, he saw Jesus, on the road to Damascus.
Mm-hmm.
So wouldn't there be a lot of skepticism?
You better believe it. And that's what I was saying. He's walking this fine line because he's telling people everything I got, I didn't get from reading a book. I got it directly from God. Some people are going to say, oh yeah, I bet you did. But then he says, I went to Jerusalem. 15 days we talked about the faith in Jesus Christ. And nothing I said contradicted what Peter and James were teaching. It doesn't talk about a conflict now. So I consulted with them. I got the tradition. I got the word. That's what he's trying to walk that line.
So when he wrote this letter, they were Christians at this time. They had already.
Yes.
So
Yes.
they had already believed and converted,
Yes.
or believed, I guess. But
But
now they were starting to doubt.
Something had changed. We don't know what it is yet. But we know, we got some hints. Because when he talks about Judaism, and he doesn't talk about his background in Judaism, he sort of presents that as maybe something the Galatians would say, he was a Jew. So maybe some Jewish teaching has gotten blended in with Christianity. And remember, whatever the Galatians are following now, or a lot of the Galatians are following, is contrary to grace. And what would be contrary to grace? Grace is a gift from God.
Well, not believing it was a gift,
Not believing is a gift. Instead, believing it was
something you had to earn.
something you had to earn, which it fits in well with Judaism because the Jews follow the law. Follow the law. So even at this point, we kind of get an idea that maybe some guys are coming in and talking about the law to those Galatians. That there are certain things you got to do in order to have relationship with God. It's not just a gift, it's more like a wage. More like a wage. Okay? So, but Paul isn't ready to confront that yet. He's establishing his credentials. Now, he says that I am not lying to you. After he goes to Jerusalem, where does he go?
I had it here a minute ago.
In verse 21,
Syria.
he goes to Syria and Cilicia, and
Know how to pronounce that.
what kind of reception does he get?
Well, it was unknown.
He was unknown.
He was unknown to him, so he is a stranger, right?
They are.
Except they got an idea that this was the one that was persecuting Christians, but when he leaves, what's their response? They glorify God
In me.
because of me. So as he's doing this, so he's gotten, think about what he said. He's gotten this word from his gospel from God, right?
Right.
He consulted the church and the leaders in Jerusalem, and they didn't say, Paul, you're wrong. Talked to him 15 days, everything was cool. Went out to these areas where he was, the only thing that people knew about him was that he persecuted the church. When he walked into their church, when he walked out, they were glorifying God. Okay. That's a pretty good background, right?
And did
That's a
he-
pretty good background.
What you said a minute ago, did he say that they glorified God because of me?
Well, yeah, that's what he
Wouldn't
says.
that be kind of like,
Arrogant?
yes,
Yeah, boy.
I'm pretty
What
special.
does that tell you about the Apostle Paul?
he's pretty confident in himself.
The Apostle Paul is unbelievably confident in himself. Would have to be. Understand, we're talking about a time when there's nothing written down. The only thing about Christianity are preachers coming in and telling the story. But none of the story's written down. Paul is fighting for what Christianity is going to become. Because everybody and his brother has an idea. It's not like now we can open the Bible and say, oh, well, it says this. Nobody's got that. Nobody's got it. The New Testament doesn't exist. There aren't any Gospels written, when Paul is writing this letter. So the only thing they know is what preachers passing through are saying. And some preachers passing through, hard for you to believe, preach stuff that is crazy.
For sure.
Yeah, it's preaching crazy stuff. So Paul has to believe that what he is saying is true. He can't afford to say, well, that's one way to look at it. Paul's going to say, what I taught you about grace
is the way.
is the only way. And in fact, if I come back to you and say, I've got second thoughts. Maybe grace isn't what it's all about. Maybe there's something more important than grace. What should you do to me? If I come in and preach that message, what should you do to me? Kick me out. Kick me out. Because I'm no longer preaching the truth anymore. So what I gave you is, and what he's going to do is he's going to prove that. He's going to do a lot of stuff to prove that what he taught was right. But we're not there yet. We don't even know what the problem is yet. But we're getting there. So Paul's established. This is who I am. Like I said, Paul's a plotter. Change, this radical change, got the message from God, consistent with what the church of Jerusalem is teaching, consistent. It has gotten enormous reception as I've preached it. People are glorifying God. 14 years later, chapter 2, What happens 14 years later?
He went to Jerusalem.
He goes to Jerusalem again. And who is with him?
Barnabas.
Barnabas
Titus.
shows up, and Titus. Ooh. First, why would he have Barnabas and Titus? Why would he have two people with him? What will two people do for him? Testify. He's got witnesses. So what he says has got to be true. Also, it's very interesting that Titus, that name is Greek. That's a Greek name, which means Titus is not
A Jew.
a Jew. Barnabas is, but Titus is not a Jew. So he goes to Jerusalem with Barnabas, he with his background in Judaism, Barnabas with his background in Judaism, and Titus a Greek, right? And why does he go to Jerusalem? Now, see, it's really cool what Paul is doing. What's that?
To preach.
Is that what he says? What does he say in verse 2?
Get an update.
Oh, he had a revelation.
I had a revelation. See, these little things become really important because this is Paul making. So he goes to Jerusalem because he what? Received a revelation from
God.
God. I went to Jerusalem because God sent me to Jerusalem. Okay? God's in control. Now, when he gets into Jerusalem, what does he do? What does Paul do 14 years later, after all the success he's had in Syria and Cilicia, goes to Jerusalem? Why is he in Jerusalem? God sent him there. What does he do when he gets there?
To preach to the Gentiles.
Well, what does it say? He does what? He lays before them, right? Now, who is in Jerusalem? Who are the people in Jerusalem?
Those are the leaders.
The leaders. The church leaders are in Jerusalem. Like Peter. You know, James, the brother of Jesus, is gone now.
How does
But-
Peter go to Rome?
Well, because the church headquarters is where?
In Jerusalem?
In Jerusalem. It's not in Rome yet.
Okay, but 14 years is
Long time. Is a long time.
I mean, based on, they had to be around Jesus' age when he was crucified.
Well, remember,
So this is going to be putting them in their 50s.
well, that and you know the fact one, I told you they love prime numbers. 14 is a combination of two sevens. So the 14 becomes, with these two sevens, become kind of a special. That's sort of a special number. You know, 14. The 14, he's been successful then. He has been a successful missionary for a long time. A long time. So it's not like he did this for a couple of months and then went to Jerusalem to tell him. He's been doing this for 14 years. Goes to Jerusalem, and what does he do for him? He lays out for him what? The kind of message he's been preaching to the Gentiles. What he's been preaching in Cilicia and Syria. This is the message I've been giving them. Now, is he asking permission from the church in Jerusalem? No.
They had already done that.
Well, that's right. When he went the first time and, you know, they talked, then he left, started preaching. Now he's back 14 years later. He says to the church leaders, this is what I've been preaching, right?
Right.
And lays it out for them. And what happens at that meeting?
Well, they,
Tell them about the false brothers.
Well, even before the false brothers, when he comes, he's at this meeting, right? And he's laying in front of them what he's been preaching. And he brought two people with him, right?
Right.
Who's with Barnabas, who's a good Jew, but Titus, who is a Greek.
Right.
And what does he say about, and again, now we're getting a better idea about what's happening in the Galatian church. What does he say about Titus?
He was compelled to be circumcised.
Well, he was, did it say he was compelled to be, did they make Titus get circumcised?
No?
It says Well, here it says,
What does it say?
but neither Titus, who was with me, being a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised.
Let me see, because that's not any they didn't compel him to be circumcised.
But it says it here.
Okay, neither. Neither Titus
Neither
was,
made him.
yes, was compelled. So Titus wasn't compelled to be circumcised, which means you got these Jews in a room. Paul is laying out for him his mission to the Gentiles. Titus, the only Greek in the room who has not been circumcised. And the Jews say,
It's okay.
it's okay. We're not going to say that Titus needs to be circumcised. Which means Titus does not need to become
A Jew.
a Jew to be a Christian. Wow, this is a big deal. And it tells us maybe something that's happening in the Galatian church. Maybe there are people who are teaching you can believe in Jesus and not be circumcised, but if you really want to be a top-notch Christian, you better follow Jewish law. And the first Jewish law a man needs to follow is what? Circumcision. Circumcision. That's the first one. And what Paul is saying here is, I was meeting with the head of the church, laying out what I was doing. Titus was right there, and nobody in the room told Titus to do what? Get yourself circumcised, and then come back. They didn't do it. Which must mean what?
That they approved it.
That you don't have to do that. That was not a big
You
deal.
don't have to be a Jew to become a Christian.
That's right. This was not a big deal for the Jewish leaders in this room. Now, what happened after the meeting? So the meeting was great. Titus was there. They listened to what I was doing. Nobody compelled him to be circumcised. After the meeting, what happened? Now, who slips in?
The spies.
We got spies. And how does he describe them?
False brothers.
False brothers. These are people who are false, right? Now, as soon as we see false brothers, what do we know about them? We don't have to read anything else about them. What do we automatically know if he calls them false
They're
brothers?
not Christians.
They aren't Christians. They may
appear to be.
They may claim to be, but we, the reader, know
They're not.
they aren't. Not in Paul's mind. That they were false. And in fact, Paul gives us their motivation. Why were they sent into? The meeting went great. Why were they sent in?
Pharisees sent them in.
Well, why? Now these are Christians. The people who appear to be Christians. Why were they sent? Because Paul gives us some motivation. Why were they brought into the group? There was only one reason why they were brought into the group.
It had to be to reinforce what's going on with the Galatians moving away from grace.
Now, yeah, okay.
That would be the only reason I can see that they would.
What does Paul say? What? You're right, but what words does Paul use? They're there to spy on what?
On Paul's teaching.
In particular, what about his teaching?
Being a Gentile, having to be a Jew.
Well,
grace.
Okay, it has to do with grace, right?
Right.
If you look at verse 4, they were spies to undermine the freedom we have in Jesus. They are spies that are undermining grace. And why are they doing it?
Because their church is.
What would be the opposite? What would be the opposite of freedom?
Bondage.
Bondage, right? They are there to undermine the freedom we have in Christ. And who experienced that freedom? Everybody at that meeting. Because clearly Titus didn't even need to be circumcised. The freedom we have in Christ, here these guys slip in. And they're going to undermine that freedom we have. And so that they can put us in bondage, so they can enslave us again. But were they successful?
No.
They weren't successful even for a minute. All right, so we've got this meeting, and even though they tried to undermine the freedom they had in Christ, they weren't successful. And after the meeting was over, in verse 6, what happens after the meeting is over?
I would
Made no
say
difference.
Paul is.
Okay, after the meeting was over and Paul left, what did Paul take with him?
The verified credentials.
Well, he had verified credentials. Did he take with him a message?
Yeah.
What does he say?
He said you don't have to be a Jew to be a
Well,
Christian. You
but
don't have to-
was Paul teaching that anyway? Yeah, he
Yeah.
was. They gave him
authority
nothing. No, because where did Paul get his authority?
from God?
From God. They gave him nothing. The only thing they would have said is,
Yeah, okay, they agreed with
good
you.
job. Good job. They contributed nothing to his message. Why is that so important? Well, again, we're dealing with, did I get this message from human beings? No, I got it from God. But the human beings who were leading the church, did they object to this message?
No.
No, they didn't. No, they didn't. They didn't even require that Titus get circumcised, become a Jew. So they didn't have a problem with my message at all.
you said they-
In fact, they took a step further. What did they do according to verse 7? Not only did they not say, well, Paul, you need to include this in your message. You need to make sure you say this. What does he say they did in verse 7?
He's been entrusted with the task of preaching
To whom?
to
The
the
Gentiles.
Gentiles.
To the Gentiles. Just like who? He drops a name in there.
Peter.
Peter was entrusted to preach the gospel to
Gentiles. Rome.
the Jews.
To the Jews.
Peter would preach it to the Jews. I would preach it to
Gentiles.
the Gentiles. So Peter to the Jews, me to the Gentiles. Did they add anything to my message? No. Did they tell me to tell anything to the Gentiles? In terms of what they needed to do?
Well,
No.
well, he could verify that they didn't have to be circumcised.
Well, but Paul doesn't want to say, they told me that, because as soon as he said, well, they told me to tell you that, then he's getting his information from human beings. So Paul doesn't want to open that door. It came from God, and everybody at that meeting said, not only do I not have a problem with what you're doing, you are going to preach the gospel to the uncircumcised. And Peter will preach to the circumcised.
But
And that's good.
wouldn't
Oh, that's what Paul said.
wouldn't the fact, there had to be people that, I'm going to say there had to be people that were looking at the church leaders in Jerusalem, and the fact that they didn't disagree with anything he said, wouldn't that, in a roundabout way, put a stamp on approval?
Sure it would.
Well, then-
Absolutely.
So then actually he did take
Although if he said, well, I preached it because they gave me my stamp of approval. They approved my message. Then who has authority?
God.
Well, if I say, I'm preaching this
The
message
church.
because they approved it,
the church and the,
then they have authority.
Yeah, but
Right?
when-
And
when-
Paul doesn't want to go there.
well, but doesn't that go there with people that are like on the fence?
Well, maybe. But
Wouldn't
Paul's
that-
not going to
wouldn't
say,
that
if you
No,
say,
he's not gonna
he's
say
not
it.
going to say it.
He's not going to say it, but they're going to know it.
They're going to
And
say,
they're going to take that as, reinforcement.
Right.
yes, if you're a person that really values what the church in Jerusalem says, if you're a Presbyterian that really values what Louisville says, what comes out of Louisville, then, if that's what you value, then having Louisville say, I think he's doing a great job, means a lot to you. Will mean a lot to you. If you don't value it, you won't care. But Paul isn't going to say, my message comes from there. He's not going to say, that's where my message comes from. My message comes from
God.
comes from God. Okay, but it does tell
They
us.
know that in Louisville.
It does tell. It does say something about. It does say something about what the Galatians may value. The fact that Paul spends so much time talking about Jerusalem, that if the people in the Galatian churches hated Jerusalem, would Paul go into all this detail about going to Jerusalem?
No.
Doesn't do it in the Corinthian letter. Doesn't do it in the Roman letter. Does it here. Tells us that this is a church that really values what people in Jerusalem think. And Paul is writing to his audience. So he's saying that if you value what Peter, in fact, he gives a list. Not only is it Peter and James, who else does he say had no problem with what he was teaching? That gave that authorization to preach to the uncircumcised.
All the apostles.
All the apostles, the pillars of the church, said, go to it. Now understand, all of this is in Acts. But Acts, Luke presents it in a very different way, this apostolic conference. Because Paul leaves with a list of things that, you can't eat meat offered to idols. You can't eat meat with blood in it. You have to abstain from, he's got a whole list of things the Gentiles had to follow. But not here. They said everything you're saying is good.
Good.
Not adding anything to your message. Okay. Now, so we've got Paul background, we've got Paul, he's doing what's right. There is no objection in Jerusalem about how he's preaching the gospel. Now in verse 11, he gets to a specific situation. So we've got like three parts. One, his personal change. The second, this meeting in Jerusalem where nobody had a problem with what he was doing, although we know there are spies that are trying to undermine freedom, right? They're there trying to undermine it, add things to the gospel. What happens in Antioch, starting in verse 11?
He opposed Peter.
He opposed Peter face to face. Now, that tells you that who knows about this? Who must know about this? Well, Peter knows about it. Who else knows about it? The fact that Paul would mention this. Because he just said that Peter and all the people in Jerusalem thought what he was saying is right on the mark, right? The fact that he would say, but in Antioch, I ended up having to oppose Peter.
Well, the people.
Or he doesn't even say Peter. He said, I had to oppose Cephas. Again, going back to the Hebrew name. I'd oppose Cephas face to face. Maybe in the Galatian churches, a rumor had been spread. Paul opposed Peter himself. You should have heard what happened in Antioch. Paul chewed Peter out. And how do we view Peter?
Oh, pretty high.
He was the number one apostle, right?
The rock.
Who does Paul think he is, chewing Peter out? Am I going to listen to Paul? Heck no. Who am I going to listen to first? Peter or Paul? Peter, for crying out loud. I'm not going to listen to Paul. It's okay if Peter agrees with him, but if it comes to a contest between Peter and Paul, I'm going to be with Peter. So evidently, I think the Galatians knew about this, and that's why he's going to introduce it right here. But he's going to spin it in this opposition in the way he wants them to accept it, to hear the story, because he's going to tell them the story. He's going to put his own spin on it. What leads to this confrontation with Peter? What's the situation in Antioch? We know Paul is there. We know Peter is there, right?
Yep.
And in fact, he says he stood self-condemned. And if Peter is self-condemned, that means he's condemning himself. He does something. Paul didn't need to condemn him. Peter condemned himself.
Well, then Peter must have been listening to some of what he was saying and changing his mind a little
Well,
bit.
let's see what Paul says. What happens in Antioch? So we got Peter and Paul in Antioch.
I don't remember what happened.
Okay.
Well, he ate with the Gentiles.
Okay, Peter is
Oh, is this where?
that's right, is eating with the Gentiles. And if Peter is eating with the Gentiles are not circumcised, right?
Right.
Okay, eating with the Gentiles, then Peter must think what?
Gentiles are okay.
Gentiles okay. Gentiles can be Christians without being circumcised.
Is it-
Gentiles can be Christians without following Jewish law.
Is this where though Peter gets up and when the Jews come in and
Some people come from James, from Jerusalem, show up, and what does Peter do?
he gets up to eat with them? Moves to the next stage,
Yeah, at the cover dish dinner,
and that's what.
you know, Peter is eating with the Gentiles, everything is cool. Some people come from Jerusalem. And what do? They eat at their own table. So what does Peter do?
He goes over to eat with them.
He gets up and goes and eats with the people from Jerusalem. And Paul,
Gets a little
though,
upset.
yeah, well, Paul doesn't, if he just said, and Peter got up and ate with them, then you could say, well, Peter knew them, he was going to eat with his friends, hadn't seen them in a while. But Paul gives us Peter's motivation. Why does Peter choose to get up and leave the Gentiles and eat with the Jews?
Because they are Jews.
That's to prove a point.
Well, what does Paul say? What words does he use in verse 12?
He was afraid of those who belonged.
He was afraid of them. He was afraid of the circumcised. That circumcised faction. The group that believed Christians needed to be circumcised. Christians needed to follow the Jewish law. He was afraid of them. Which means Paul is calling Peter what?
A hypocrite.
Gentile.
He's calling him a hypocrite. He's calling him a coward. Because Peter, it was okay to eat with Gentiles until these Jewish Christians show up. And then Peter wimps out and goes to eat with the Jewish Christians. And Paul says it didn't because of friendship. It was because Peter was afraid. He was afraid. But that fear ended up, and who else did it affect? It not only affected him, Barnabas. It affected Barnabas too. Because Barnabas got up and ate with the Jews, ate with the circumcised. And Paul says that's not just cowardism. They aren't just cowards. They are hypocrites. And why is using that word hypocrite such a big deal?
Because he's saying one thing and showing another.
Saying one thing, showing another. Who did Jesus call hypocrites? The Pharisees. The Pharisees were hypocrites.
Right.
Because the Pharisees were always talking about God. But they weren't living it. They weren't living it. And
Therefore, Jesus wouldn't have had to go to the cross.
that's right. And he really nails them. He really condemns them on their hypocrisy. That's what Paul says Peter is doing when he gets up and moves to the Jews because he's afraid of them. He's afraid of what those Jewish Christians are going to do. And they're hypocrites because what does Paul see in what Barnabas and Peter and the other Jewish Christians who were there in Antioch? What are they doing?
Their weakness, they're showing that they're not strong enough in their beliefs of God.
Well, they are certainly cowards.
Right.
But Paul sees this as even bigger than just being personal cowards. What they are doing is,
rejecting the Gentiles.
that's it. They're acting in a way that's contrary to the gospel. And remember, he talked about in chapter 1 about the gospel. If there's only one gospel, and that's a gospel of grace, right?
Right.
Yeah.
What they're doing is they're acting in contradiction to that gospel of grace. They are violating that gospel of grace.
Using grace is for their convenience.
Well, they're negating it. What Paul is going to say is they're negating grace at all. You know, because if you give any gospel other than a gospel of grace, and that's what Peter has done when he moved from one table to another, you're doing something false. It's not gospel at all. It's not just another way of looking at it. It is not gospel at all. And what does Peter do? Paul do. What does Paul do?
Well, this is when he faces him off and chews him out or whatever.
That's right. Paul confronts him, and what does he tell him?
You're a hypocrite.
Sinners.
You're
Gentiles.
going wrong with.
Yeah, if you,
No.
what does he say? And we're looking at verse 14.
Yeah,
What did he say?
you
You
claim
are
you're
a
a
Jew,
Jew,
Yet
and
you
yet
live
you
like
live
a
like a
Gentile.
Gentile.
And not like a Jew.
In other words, you were fine hanging out with Gentiles.
Until
You were fine. But now you're not going to hang out with anybody but Jews. You're fine hanging out with Gentile Christians. That's the key. We're not talking about Jews, non-Christian Jews. We're talking about Jewish Christians, Gentile Christians. You were fine with Gentile Christians.
And they're trying to make the Gentiles
And
follow
now-
the Jewish customs.
Now, by moving from this table to that table, you're saying that these Gentile Christians aren't good enough. They aren't good enough. Until they what?
get circumcised.
Become Jews. Then you'll hang out with them again.
What they should have done was put, hey, let's put the tables together.
Yeah, that's right. Paul is saying to Peter, what? You are a hypocrite. You are a hypocrite. And what you're doing has consequences greater than, you're just not showing a lot of personal integrity. It's, you are preaching a gospel contrary to a gospel of grace. Because you're telling every Gentile Christian in that room that they aren't good enough. They aren't good enough for you.
So the word really hadn't gotten out from the church hierarchy that you didn't have to be circumcised. You didn't have to become
Well,
a Jew to be
what-
a Christian. That sort of was like not
Well,
out there yet.
what we get from how Paul describes it is when they told Paul, remember they had no objection to what he was doing, preaching to the Gentiles. In fact, they said, you're doing such a good job,
Keep it up.
keep it up. In fact, I want you to focus on Gentiles because you're doing such a good job. Yeah, it should have gone out because that's what the church was saying. These guys who show up are not representing Christianity.
No, they're representing Jews
They're representing Judaism.
as
That-
a Christian.
That's right.
With
They're wearing
culture-
Christian clothes,
with
but really,
culture around-
that's right. They aren't representing Jesus Christ. They're representing something else, and that's the problem. For Paul, right there is the problem. And in fact, he goes into that even after he confronts Peter, because in verse 15, 16, and he starts talking about the implications of what Peter did. What's the implication of what Peter did?
Well, you're going to affect your ministry to Gentiles.
Well,
You're saying
mean,
you
you're
have to
not
follow
gonna-
the law.
even more, you're right, but even more than that, if we believe we are justified through grace, and just for Paul, justify doesn't mean forgive. Justify has to do with relationship. If we believe we are put in a right relationship with God through God's gift, as soon as you introduce the law to that, what have you done?
You've degraded it.
You've taken the gift out.
Take away the faith.
The gift is gone. There is no more gift. You're not trusting in God anymore. Who are you trusting in?
The law.
I had a conversation with somebody the other day. Who are you actually trusting in? The minute I add something to grace, believe grace is a gift. You know the most powerful word in the English language? This is my opinion. Most powerful word in the English language? 3 letters. But. is the most powerful word in the English language. When I was a kid and would go into church, my mother, bless her heart, would say, this you could count on it, would look at me and say, Eddie, that's what she called me, Eddie, you look so good. Wearing my little bow tie, because of that sport coat, because that's what we wore to church. And she had gloves on and all. You look so good, but,
But
and what was going to follow the but?
some kind of criticism.
Some kind of criticism. And as soon as she said but, what happened to what she said before?
Negated.
Shh, put a line through it. But is that all you could do with your hair? But why didn't you take a bath last night? But those shoes don't match your pants. It would be something. It would be a but. And what but does is it negates everything that goes
Well
before.
then, Mom, why didn't you set my class out for me?
And that would have, then Dad would have not been happy. So but negates
There
what
you-
comes.
your
Yeah,
but.
that's right. But negates what comes on before. If I say grace, our relationship with God is grounded on grace, and grace is a gift, and that's what Paul's saying. But what's going to follow? But let me tell you how it's not really a gift. But you've got to accept it. So it's not a gift anymore, right? It's something what? You have to do.
Necessary.
But you need to do this. But you need to do that. But you need to be circumcised. But you need to... As soon as I add a but at the end of grace, then what have I done?
You negated.
It's
what-
not a gift anymore.
Right.
It's something you have to do. And that's what Paul is saying right here. The minute I add something, and it doesn't matter what kind of law it is, something to grace, what have I lost? I've lost grace. But even more than that, if I add something that I have to do, then what am I saying about Jesus Christ?
Saying he wasn't the right one.
He didn't need to die.
Right.
Why did Jesus need to die? If I have the ability to do it, then Jesus coming was ridiculous, was a waste of time, waste of blood. Because it's all up to who?
You.
Me, right? And the minute I bring me into the equation, who have I taken out?
God.
I've taken Jesus and God out. I've taken Jesus and God out. And that's why Paul says it is so crucially important that we don't remove grace. Because if we take Jesus out of the equation, what is my condition?
You're in control.
I'm in control, but in terms of the whole big picture, I'm lost. Because you know something? If it's up to me, I'm going to blow it.
For sure.
I'm going to blow it. So you put any of it in my hands, I'm going to blow it. So if Jesus didn't need to die, because I could have done it anyway, I'm going to blow it. His death is in vain, and I am totally lost.
That would be a reason why there isn't step 1, step 2, step
That's exactly right.
That most, I would say, the majority of people would like to see.
Well, why would we want to do that? Why, if we have the opportunity to trust in grace, and grace is free, grace is a gift given to you by God, why do we want to put a but? Why do we want to put, but you got to do this, but you got to do that? Why do we want that but in there? Because that leaves who in charge?
You.
Me! And who wants to be in charge? Me! I want to be in charge. Because if I'm in charge, then I don't need to
Trust in God.
trust in God. I really don't need to trust in God. Because I'm in charge.
Because you're trusting in yourself.
Yeah, I'm trusting in myself. And that's why Paul says such a little thing as Peter going from one table to another. because he was afraid. That's why for Paul that is such a huge deal. Because what Paul is saying is the Gentiles aren't doing, Paul is saying in Peter's eyes, the Gentiles aren't doing enough. And therefore he has to move. And Paul is saying as soon as you believe that, then not only have you lost this sense of grace, you have said the death of Christ is meaningless, and you have said you are never going to be saved from your sins. Because if it's up to you, you're going to sin. And you are totally lost. That's how important grace is. Now, at this point, we know a lot about what's happening in the Galatian church. Evidently, the Galatian church, the fact that Paul would use this as an example, tells us that evidently the Galatians are doing what? What are the Galatians doing?
Turning their back on grace.
Turning their back on grace. And maybe they're turning their back on grace over circumcision. That we got some Judaizers, and we'll find that next week. We got some Jewish Christians from Jerusalem coming into the Galatian church saying things like, well, it's fine to believe in Jesus Christ. That's okay. That's fine to trust in God. But if you really want to be assured of your salvation, follow some of the Jewish law. If you follow some of the Jewish law, then you'll be fine. Then you'll feel better. You'll feel closer to God. And Paul says, no, you won't. You'll feel further away from God than ever. And that's, for him, that's why. And that's the focus of the Galatian letter. Now, what we're going to look at next week, we're going to look at chapter 3. And in chapter 3, he's going to start explaining why his thesis is right. He's going to start explaining why you got to believe in grace. And he's going to give 6 reasons or 6 ways to look at it, why grace is greater than law. And that if you introduce law, you negate grace. He's going to give 6 reasons. We'll look at 3 of them next week in chapter.
Question.
Yeah.
What about Christians that I would guess you would have to say totally trust in God, such as people in the churches, usually down in Appalachia, that refuse to have their children looked at if they get sick and end up dying?
Mm-hmm.
How does that fit in?
Well,
that would be...
Well, first, what Paul is saying here is we're talking about the relationship we have with God. That's what Paul means by righteousness.
And those people think they have a close relationship.
I don't believe Paul would say, if you have a good relationship with God, you'll not get sick. And that your kids will stay healthy and you'll be happy and content. I don't think Paul would ever say that. I think in fact, Paul says just the opposite, looking at his life. His life has been really hard. And he believes it's been harder after trusting in God than before. It's better in that he's got hope, but in terms of his physical condition, it's been hard following. And he doesn't hesitate talking about how many times he's been persecuted and he's endured all this stuff. So I don't think Paul would look down there and say, oh yeah, they're doing exactly right. What he would say is, if they believe their relationship with God is grounded on what God has done 100%, then they are right on the mark. Now, whether that really determines whether or not you get medical care, I'm not sure Paul would say, oh yeah, you shouldn't get medical care. I don't think he would. I don't think that's necessarily consistent. So I don't think he would say how their living reflects that. I'm having a hard time because I'm thinking out loud. I don't think those two things necessarily go together. I think I can believe my relationship with God is grounded in God and still get medical care.
Well, it's more spiritual than it is physical.
Right. I think
you don't lose grace because you do take action yourself.
Right, exactly.
On certain things and not leave it in the
right.
hands of God.
And in fact, I'd go so far as to say that's definitely what Paul says would believe, because when you look at his letters, he always talks about what you should do in response. You should love one another. You know, if you're a preacher, you should preach. If you give, you should give generously. So there are implications of living out that relationship. It's that the relationship is forged not by what you do. What you do is in response to the relationship that's already there. If, though, a person says, I'm not going to give my child medical treatment because I have this relationship with God, I think that they will ultimately be judged based on that decision. Now, how God judges them, I don't know. I don't know how God judges them. But I don't think that it automatically follows. It necessarily follows.
So the fact that I would say all human beings at some time make their own judgments,
Right.
It doesn't necessarily mean they've lost grace.
Exactly. And that's also really important, is if grace is a gift, if grace is something God's given you, then it means you can't lose it. I mean, you can't, if it's based on what you've done, then you can lose it, right? I mean, what if I stop doing? Then I've lost it. But if it's not based on what you've done, can you ever lose it? If it's a free gift of God, I can't lose grace. That's why Paul will say, what can separate us from the love of God? And the bottom line is, what can separate us from the love of God?
Turn your back on it.
Nothing. He says, nothing can separate us from the love of God. Now, can I choose to live as though God doesn't love me? Sure I can. Can I choose to live as though God is an enemy? Sure I can. But does that cause God to stop loving me? No.
So that's where
Because his love is based on him, not me. As long as it's based on me, I can lose it. His love is a wage. But it isn't. His love is a gift. And that's what Paul is getting at here in the Galatian letter. And that's what he's going to work to show to us. Why that is so important and why that just makes sense. Contrary ideas just don't. This makes sense. And that's what he's writing to the Galatians. Does that make sense?
Well, it makes sense with your philosophy that, in my opinion, that's what, when you say everybody's going to heaven, your destiny has been already determined.
Yeah, I'll say. I'll say that our ultimate destiny is in the hands of God.
Yeah.
And I'm going to trust God.
And there's nothing you can do about
And
that.
and it's in God's hands. And you either choose to trust that it's a gift or not. But there ain't anything you're going to do to change it. It's in God's hands.
May answer for I may be standing behind you in line, but
Yeah. Well, I think we pay the consequences. I think we pay the consequences for our actions.
Yeah.
But if it's either a gift or it's not. And if it's not a gift, good luck. And I mean that. I'm serious. If it's not a gift, good luck. I hope you figure out the right things to do.
The gift to me is these people that deny help for their children. The gift to me is the fact that they're able to get that help for their children.
Yeah, I cannot imagine the Apostle Paul saying you should not. If you refuse to get medical care, or if you refuse to eat, or if you refuse to just trust God, I think Paul would say you're misunderstanding the relationship.
I think God, I've always felt, that's why God gave us a brain to use it in circumstances like that.
Well, I think if Christians spent more time worrying about what they were going to do tomorrow than what God will do at the end, I think we'd be a whole lot better. Because where we spend our eternal destiny is in his hands. I mean, it's based on grace. And we trust in it or we don't. What I do tomorrow, that's in my hands. Whether I'm going to go home and yell at my wife, that's not in God's hands. That's in my hands.
Right.
Whether or get yelled at by my wife. If I choose not, what do they say? What do they say about
that's more likely to happen.
whether it's whether it's the stone hitting the pitcher or the pitcher hitting the stone,
Whether the bug
it's
hits
going to
the-
be bad on the pitcher.
Sometimes the bug hits the windshield and sometimes you're the bug.
Yeah, well, that's right. That's right. Well, whether it's the bug hitting the windshield or the windshield hitting the bug, it's going to be bad on the bug.
Worse yet, if you're on a motorcycle, hit your teeth.
Yeah, I hear those.
Keep your mouth shut.
Yeah, let's have a word of prayer. Lord God, thank you for guiding us through this. Remind us that it's all grounded in grace. And even though we are all tempted to add something to grace so that we can feel maybe more secure, we don't have to trust quite so much, help us to look past those things and simply trust in you. Trust in your love, trust in your compassion, trust in your Son. Help us to do that in the name of Christ our Savior. Amen. All right, next week we'll look at